All right, it's 7:02 now, so we're going to go ahead and get started. It looks like most people have gotten in here. So hello and welcome to ADAPT, Activating a Resilient Future. I'm Brendan Rivers. I'm the lead reporter for ADAPT from WJCT Public Media. ADAPT is our project focused on how climate change is affecting Northeast Florida and what's being done about it. Please sign up for our monthly ADAPT newsletter to make sure you're the first to read in-depth original reporting and to find out more events like this one. Sign up after the event at adaptflorida.org. Tonight's program is co-presented by WJCT, the Northeast Florida Regional Council, and the Jacksonville Environmental Protection Board. Before we really kick things off, I want to go over some general housekeeping real quick. Audience members will be muted throughout the event, but if you have any questions for our panelists, please feel free to type them out at any time in the Zoom Q&A chat window. We'll try to answer as many of those questions as we can tonight after each panel discussion. We'll have 2 of those panel discussions here tonight. You can interact with each other in the chat window, but we will only be taking questions from the Q&A window. Mr. Suma, if you wouldn't mind muting your microphone real quick. Thank you, sir. So if your question is for a specific panelist, please be sure to include their name with the question so we know who to direct it to. And during these Q&A sections, we'll have a poll pop up, a live poll will pop up on your screen. So please answer those questions when you're prompted, and we'll take a look at the results before we wrap up those Q&A sessions. So now, as we get started, here's my co-host for the evening, Sean Lahav.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us. I would like to ask Mr. Suma to please turn on your video camera and unmute yourself. Thank you. My name is Sean Lahav, and I'm the Resiliency Coordinator for the Northeast Florida Regional Council. The NEFRC is a government agency that serves 7 counties and 26 municipalities across Northeast Florida. Our program areas cover planning and policy, emergency preparedness, healthcare preparedness, economic development, and what we're here to talk about this evening, the issue of resilience. The Northeast Florida Regional Council Board of Directors includes elected officials and gubernatorial appointees, including our very own guest this evening, who serves as an officer on the NEFRC Executive Committee, Jacksonville City Councilwoman Randy DeFore. Councilmember DeFore is also the current chair of Jacksonville's Special Committee on Resiliency. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Also joining us tonight is Mr. Eric Suma, Chief of Planning and Environmental Policy for the Jacksonville District of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Thank you.
It's a pleasure, Sean. Thank you.
Thank you both for agreeing to participate in this very important discussion tonight. So we're going to get right into it. In setting the stage for this evening, one of the most important components of this discussion relates to defining the word resilience. From each of your individual perspectives, what does resilience mean to you, and why is it such an important word? And we can start off with Councilwoman DeFore.
Thank you, Sean. From my perspective, resiliency means the ability to withstand or recover from an adverse event in a short period of time. So that's the basis upon which we're going forward with our committee. Thank you.
And Mr. Suma?
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's really the ability of a community to weather a storm. It's involved with not only weathering the storm, but just as the Councilwoman stated, it's the ability to absorb and then adapt for the next storm, because resiliency is not prevention. We'll never fully prevent storm damage or flooding with resiliency, but with good planning and appropriate management measures, we can improve our ability to respond and have less damage at the future storm.
So, Mr. Suma, in following up on that response, Northeast Florida has faced numerous challenges over the last several years relating to hurricane impacts, coastal flooding, and storm surge, issues that you're very familiar with. In addition to these specific hazards, sea level rise looms as a long-range future threat for the region. How do you describe this specific issue of sea level rise to members of the public? And what do we know about sea level rise as it relates to low-lying and flood-prone areas in Northeast Florida?
Sure. Well, so sea levels continue to rise, and unfortunately, they're rising at a more rapid rate than they had risen historically. So, you know, we consistently monitor gauges throughout the country, and our local gauges here show us that trend. So just in Mayport, what we're finding is that sea levels have continued to rise on the range of approximately a foot, 0.87 feet over the last 100 years. But strikingly, over the past 20 years, the rate of that rise has been incrementally larger than it had been in the past. So just as an example, in South Florida, we found that the rate of rise over the last 5 years has been 3 inches in South Florida. And that's 3 times greater than the rate of rise in the past 50 years in South Florida. So we don't precisely know the reasons for the rate of rise. There's a lot behind that, but we do find that sea level is rising, and it's a concern. So it's a concern for folks that live close to the coast, folks that live in low-lying areas.
Thank you for that response. And so bringing this down to the local level here in Northeast Florida, paying particular attention to what our local communities are facing when we're looking at this issue. The city of Jacksonville has gained a lot of attention at the regional and state level recently because of work being engaged by the City Council Special Committee on Resiliency. Councilmember DeFore, what has been the role of the Special Committee on Resiliency? And since its formation in January of this year, what are the main lessons that Jacksonville has learned from this specific process?
Well, I can tell you we're learning a lot. So let me just go back and explain how we got here. And I think a large part of this has to do with City Councilman Matt Carlucci and his other job. He is a State Farm agent. And as we all know, when Irma happened, not only did we see what we saw in normal hurricanes, which wasn't even a hurricane, it was a tropical storm when it got to us, but we saw huge flooding occur inland. And I think that really drove Councilman Carlucci's desire to have this special committee on resiliency. And so it was started in January of 2020, and a little bit of work was done at that point. And then it was handed off to me in June of this year. And at that point, actually it's not, I guess, yeah, it was June of this year. We were in the middle of COVID. And so at that point, we broke it down to 3 subcommittees. One is on communication and education, which is headed up by Councilwoman Joyce Morgan, who you will have on your next panel. She's incredible. We also have an infrastructure subcommittee that's headed up by Garrett Dennis. His other hat he wears when he's not working for the council is construction. And then the third committee, subcommittee is on environmental, and that is being headed up by Matt Carlucci. So these 3 subcommittees have brought in tremendous experts, experts in certain areas and different areas. And we've learned a lot. We've learned through bringing in the departments, our local departments, our public works department, what areas are they working on? What areas of concern in the planning department? What areas of concern have they been addressing? We brought in, as you know, you've helped us with bringing in the Corps. What is the Corps concerned with? FEMA has come before us, and we talked about what we see, what they're identifying, and then with the conservancy group. So we have looked at this in a very broad perspective, identified the areas that we should be addressing, and how we can address it, which has been interesting. I've learned more from the environmental section than I thought I ever could. I mean, there's a lot of things we can do from a natural resource perspective that between trees and living shorelines that I never thought possible.
Thank you, council member. And to let everyone in the audience know, we will be hearing from subject matter experts who are featured on one of those subcommittees this evening. So we look forward to that. And so expanding this slightly to a larger scale, Mr. Suma, one of the developments from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers recently has been the congressionally funded $16 million South Atlantic Coastal Study, also referred to by the acronym SACS. What are the objectives and end goals of this multi-state study that stretches beyond Florida, and how will local governments like the city of Jacksonville benefit from the results and strategies that are produced?
Yeah, thank you for that, Sean. So, Yeah, just as you said, in 2016, Congress directed us to do a large-scale coastal study to evaluate risk and vulnerability of communities from North Carolina all the way around Peninsula Florida to Mississippi, and included Puerto Rico and the USVI. So it's quite extensive. We're talking about several thousand linear miles of coastline. Because it's so large, they did give us a lot of money, $16 million. And it's rare to have that happen because most of the time we do things in partnership with communities. So there's usually a cost share, but in this case, the federal government is paying for it 100%. So it is to analyze and identify areas that are most vulnerable along the coast. It's to set up a system of tools to help communities analyze their own risk and to try to find opportunities to manage that risk. Risk management doesn't always come from the federal government. In fact, it's really coming from all levels of government. It needs to. And so SACS is defined in part to help local communities respond to risk themselves, and where the federal government can step in with specific authority, it's going to do that as well. And then finally, through this effort, and it's been going on for a couple of years, and it's going to conclude in 2022, we ended up identifying specific focus areas that enable us to put more resources to better identify the vulnerability and risk in specific areas. Northeast Florida happens to be one of those focus areas. We're really happy about that. We've got 7 focus areas in the state of Florida. We were able to get Northeast Florida into that. And I'm happy about that because that's going to help us, again, to bring a little bit more resources into the area, and hopefully get Jacksonville, the help it needs to get on the resiliency track it's looking for.
Thank you for that great explanation. And so moving back to the local level and looking at the leverage that can be utilized with something like the South Atlantic Coastal Study, I'd like to address a specific point. In both the public and private sectors, governments and corporations are starting to recognize the value and benefits of appointing a Chief Resilience Officer position, also referred to as a CRO. In Florida, for example, almost every major city and county in the state has hired a Chief Resilience Officer to navigate these complex challenges. Councilman DeFort, where is the city of Jacksonville at in the CRO hiring process that was recently announced in the city's budget? And from your perspective, especially on the special committee, what are the main priorities and objectives for Duval County if a CRO were to be appointed?
Well, after going through this whole process, there's no doubt in my mind that a Chief Resiliency Officer is critical in addressing resiliency issues. So let's talk about, why that is, and I'll tell you, then I'll get into where we are into the hiring. And that's because on the local level, you have all these various departments, and they're all kind of in their own silos. And so you have the planning department, you have the public works department, you have neighborhoods, you have parks, and then they don't necessarily talk across lines. They're all in their own world. And so a Chief Resiliency Officer will be able to come in and cross all those lines, and their only objective is addressing resiliency issues. So it really is important that we have, and then they can also, from a funding perspective, look at what funding we can achieve through state funds and what funds we can achieve through federal funds. Because one of the things that Mr. Sima was talking about was, with the Corps, once the Corps does their work through federal funding, then they can help create a plan for a local community. And I think a Chief Resiliency Officer will help us in that regard. But going back, we do have money. We had a AAA, as you know, committee that came, and one of the things that they said that we need to have is a Chief Resiliency Officer. So based on their findings, that is in the budget. So we will be hiring a Chief Resiliency Officer in this year. Now, what we haven't done is codified that. And what that means is we have not changed our charter to have a permanent position for a Chief Resiliency Officer. And that is important because, otherwise it would be that position would be subject to budget. You're going to or even a political, right? So we met with Jim Murley this year, as you know. He was the resiliency officer in Miami, and he works at the pleasure of his current mayor. So that position could be gone tomorrow, depending on who the mayor is. And so we want to make sure that this position is a permanent position that's not subject to political whim as to whether they agree with resiliency or not. So going back, we have it in the budget. They're in the process of, they are working to get it higher. But in addition to that, this committee, this resiliency committee, is working on making sure that that position is codified.
And that's a perfect segue to our next question. And I would argue that this next question is perhaps one of the most important questions of the evening. And I'm going to start off with Mr. Suma on this specific one. In looking at opportunities for partnership, one example that comes to mind right now can be found in Southwest Florida, where the Army Corps recently teamed up with Collier County on a long-term $3 billion hurricane protection plan. In reflecting on this specific case study, are there any planning mechanisms related to hurricane and storm damage reduction that could be utilized to assist Duval County? And in addition to that, can you also speak to any existing legal authorities that would enable this type of cooperation, and if there's any cost sharing involved?
Sure. So Collier County, as you mentioned, was the recipient of the Bipartisan Act funding of 2018. I'm sure everybody remembers Irma and Maria. Well, after those storms and the significant damage that happened both not only in Peninsular Florida, but in Puerto Rico and USVI, Congress acted and provided study funding to look at resiliency measures in certain communities that were really hit hard. Southwest Florida, Collier County was one of those communities. We embarked on a $3 million study. Typically, our studies are 3 years, $3 million, but they can go up based on complexity. Most of the time, those study funds are done in partnership with a local community, and it's usually cost shared 50-50. In the Collier case, because of the Bipartisan Budget Act that happened again because of destruction from storms, they got the study completely federally funded. The study's still in the works. It's not concluded yet, but yeah, the early recommendations are for management measures that cost as much as $3 billion, as you said. There's a similar study that's happening in Miami on the southeast coast. There's a back-based study there that's looking at flooding in their community. That one is also ongoing. It started with $3 million. The community right now is looking at the outcome of the study to determine whether or not they want more time to consider other measures. And one of the reasons there is they're looking at the management measures that were recommended and whether or not they fit their community. The outcomes can be quite expensive. So you mentioned $3 billion for Collier. That's a $3 million study, $3 billion recommendation. If that is ever enacted by Congress, if we get the study authorized and if Congress appropriates funds, it won't necessarily be 100% federally funded. It'll likely be a partnership between Collier County and the federal government. Those partnerships typically are at a 65-35 cost share ratio. So it's a pretty hefty price tag. So they're using that particular BBA 18 study authority, but there are other authorities that Northeast Florida may be able to utilize. And I would love the opportunity to work with the city of Jacksonville to identify those specific authorities to see if the city is interested in partnering in a study. Unfortunately, it wouldn't be subject to BB 18 funds, and so it wouldn't be 100% federally funded. It would have to be an effort that would be cost shared 50-50 for the study. And then again, if authorized and appropriated, the subsequent recommendations from that study, again, if agreed to by the partner, would be cost shared at 65-35.
Thank you for that very insightful answer. And that leads me to a question for our council member DeFore on these same points. Council for Jacksonville examined opportunities for this type of cooperation with the federal government, and what steps need to be taken by the city to move this type of partnership opportunity forward if Duval County wanted to leverage this type of research?
So I think I shared with you, we were notified by the Corps that there was this opportunity to get on the water bill, which is a little bit, which is what Mr. Seaman was describing, and it's a partnership where the city has to be a sponsor, and the report. I think the study is $3 million, and so the city's portion of it would have been $1.5 million, and then we would have to go to our congressman to get it passed and through Congress, which all those pieces were available. So the mayor said yes. Then I went to Rutherford, and Rutherford said yes. But unfortunately, the water bill was already on the floor, and we missed the window. And the big unfortunate about it is it only comes up every 2 years. So what this resiliency officer, this can be one action item for this resiliency officer to ensure that we work with the Corps, get the city to sponsor, work with our congressman to make sure that we don't miss that opportunity again. Because the key is we've got to get in the queue. You know, once you have the study, then you're in the queue for federal funding. Until we have the study, we're not in the queue. So to me, that is going to be an action item for this chief resiliency officer for sure.
Well, thank you. And I'm glad we were able to address the specific component of the discussion in the panel. And so moving forward, we've kind of gone back and forth on scales between feds and the state and local level. This is more of a personal question. So in communicating these issues related to resilience to the public, it is important, in my view, to connect with people on a personal level, to share stories of your own experiences. The question for both of you, do any life experiences come to mind where you were impacted by a flood event, hurricane, or other related disaster? And how did that impact your long-term perspective towards these issues? And I see Councilwoman DeFore smiling, so I'm going to for this one.
Well, thank you, because you know, I'm a native of Jacksonville, so hurricanes. In fact, I was born in the year of Dora, which was our biggest hurricane until recent history, and I'm laughing because it was Irma. I mean, my district is District 14. We have Memorial Park and the infamous now Life, that picture taken where this water is coming up out of the river and consuming the Statue of Life. And it was just so on point of what we were all thinking at the time. And my house, which is not on the water, was completely surrounded by water. We literally were paddleboarding and canoeing. And it was a real wake-up call of how vulnerable we are, and that if we don't address this issue, and I think it's our fault. I mean, I'm just going to say it out loud. I think we if you look at some of the old houses in my district, they knew better. They're built off the water, by a considerable amount of yards, and we have built on the water and built on wetlands, and we've kind of done this to ourselves. So the question is, how do we fix it? And it's a heavy lift, but I think we can get there by changing some, building requirements and bringing back some natural resources such as wetlands and living shorelines.
Thank you. And Mr. Suma?
I appreciate that story. I live here in Jacksonville. I saw the crazy flooding that occurred. I'm in your district, Councilwoman, and so I did witness that. I've got a personal story where I actually saw the devastation from Hurricane Andrew. The Corps of Engineers acts as a contractor for FEMA. So when a storm comes through and a community is devastated, FEMA steps in, but they utilize the Corps of Engineers as the contractor. So while very young in my career, 1992, 93, I was asked to go down to Miami, to Homestead specifically, and help them with the cleanup. And what I saw there was just amazing. Streets were just filled with debris. And the first thing we did was try to just get the debris out of the streets. So trucks, ambulances, fire trucks, cars could just navigate. That was an incredible endeavor. And then the debris was just everywhere in people's houses. And we spent a lot of time putting blue roofs, tarps on top of people's houses just to prevent the rain from coming in after the storm, because just because the hurricane left didn't mean it stopped raining in Florida, right? So we had a lot of people with damaged roofs. So we put a lot of tarps on people's houses. But then after that, it was the cleanup. And the most striking thing to me was just the piles and piles of debris. So what we did in every neighborhood was we created piles in the neighborhood. We just got heavy equipment in there, grabbed as much as we could, put it in a pile, and then we took that pile and consolidated it into another pile and then to another pile. And these ended up being mountains of debris. We had to lease farm fields in South Miami near Florida City just to store all the debris from Hurricane Andrew. And these were literally mountains, piles of debris. So it was really striking, the devastation that can happen to a community. But fortunately, that community pulled together and they're better for it today. But I definitely don't want to see that type of thing happen in Northeast Florida.
Yeah, and thank you for that. Having grown up in Boynton Beach and spending a large majority of my childhood in Big Pine Key, down the Keys, I've also seen the devastating impacts of many hurricanes on a personal level. So I appreciate both of those stories. I think it's a very important component of these conversations. So before we get to our closing thoughts, I have one more question specifically for Mr. So one of the big components of this discussion, as we have already recognized, relates to funding and finance opportunities. So I want to take this moment to expand a little bit beyond the government perspective, a little bit beyond the Army Corps. And I'd like to ask you, are you familiar with any financing opportunity or grant funding or financing opportunities at the local or state level or national that you're specifically familiar with?
Was that, we didn't hear it. Is that to Mr. Suma?
So, yeah, sorry about that.
Okay.
The internet. So the question I have relates to the funding and financing. Are you familiar with any opportunities outside of government?
I know that there are several grants that are available through various agencies. I don't have the specifics on any of those, but I hear about them all the time. And you know, interestingly, I hear about them through resiliency officers in these different agencies and communities. So there's a resiliency officer in the South Florida Water Management District. They're currently applying for a grant from FEMA to see if they can rehabilitate some of the salinity structures that keep salt water from coming up the canals that you see in South Florida into those communities. So they're seeking a grant right now from FEMA. There are lots of grant opportunities. And again, I hear about these from resiliency officers. So hearing Councilmember DeFore and the desire to bring a resiliency officer in, I believe that type of position has the opportunity to focus on those grants and other funding streams that, you know, you wouldn't otherwise potentially get access to because you just don't have the focus there. And a resiliency officer brings that focus.
Thank you. And I hope that after this panel discussion, this conversation can continue and we can share thoughts and resources as we move forward. Closing this panel discussion before we get to audience questions, my final question of the evening is open to both of our panelists, and please feel free to share any additional thoughts that you might have. Moving forward into the next decade and beyond, what are the most important objectives that local governments in Florida will have to tackle when it comes to building community resilience?
Well, that's a very large question. I mean, I think we're seeing it. I think we're seeing the fact that we need to rethink about how we build. I think we need to rethink about our drainage systems. I mean, you know, we have, especially my district, it's an aged, you know, we over 100 years, and so we have new building that we need to think about. We need old building we need to address. And we need to figure out how to, I mean, some of it's going to be buying back property. We're doing that right now. Some of it's going to be restoring wetlands. I mean, we've got a huge nugget in front of us that we're going to have to address, and Irma's a great example of why we have to do that.
Thank you. And Mr. Sumo.
Yeah, there's a lot of challenges. I appreciate those comments from Councilmember DeFore. I mean, yes, we as humans have decided that we like to live close to the water, and that has presented a lot of challenges to us. So getting planning right to reflect future challenges is really difficult at the local level. That's a significant challenge I see all the time. One of the other things that I've been seeing in terms of challenges is once presented with management measures, once we have a study with a community and we present a community with management measures, oftentimes those management measures upset the aesthetics of the community. So oftentimes you're talking about flood walls, bulkheads, nature-based features in a lot of cases. But still, we're talking about changing the way a community interacts with the water, and that's always been a difficult thing that I've been seeing lately. So aesthetics and having a community deal with that is big. As I said before, resiliency tends to be very expensive. We mentioned the $3 billion in Collier for that recommendation. The current recommendation for Miami-Dade, though I said they might be asking for additional analysis, the current recommendation is at a price tag of $4.8 billion. So those projects, if ever enacted, would be cost shared at a 35% rate from the local community. So it's really expensive for local communities to come up with that level of funding. Of course, it doesn't have to come up at 1 year. These things take multiple years to build. So that tells you two things. One, get in line quickly, as Councilmember DeFore said, because the process of just getting through a study is significant, takes time. Competing for the study funds, one, getting a study and getting it completed, it's two, getting it authorized by Congress, and then getting appropriations for the management measures, the adaptive measures that you're recommending. That's a third piece, and all that will take several years. So funding and patience is important there. And then I guess I would end up with unique coordination at all levels of government. You really do. You need you got a lot of energy here at the local level. I appreciate the comments too about bringing Congressman Rutherford in, but you need all levels of leadership engaged and walking in the same direction with you if you're trying to build resiliency in your community.
Thank you very much to both of you for participating in this discussion. That was very insightful, and I hope to have more conversations as we move forward. So for audience members, I'm going to launch a poll right now. This will be available for 5 minutes. There's 4 questions that we'd like you to answer, and these are very simple questions, but I find them insightful. And I'm going to ask my colleague, Brendan Rivers, to turn his video and audio on. And he has selected some of the questions that audience members have asked for both of our panelists. So we're going to go to Q&A for the next 10 minutes.
All right, thank you, Sean. So I'm going to start out with a question from Tom Licata. This is specifically for you, Councilwoman Randy DeFore. How much of the flooding in Riverside and Avondale has been the result of postponed maintenance of creek beds and storm drainage versus rising sea levels?
You know, I don't know that we really know the answer to that. I can tell you that in Riverside, we are seeing the river is now higher than where the drain goes into the river. So what's happened is we're now seeing where there's no rain, the river coming up through the drainage system, through the drains, onto the streets of Riverside. So we're working on ensuring, what we're doing now is seeing if we can get a valve in the drain that where it hits the river, so that it only can go one way. They call it tie flex. So we're working on that right now. But part of it is maintenance. I mean, part of it, Mitchell Branch Park Creek takes on significant drainage. You would not believe the area that it encompasses. I mean, it goes all the way out for almost, I would say, a half mile in every direction. So I do think that some of it is old, the fact that we have a deteriorating drainage system, and we're working on that right now. I'm working on it with John Pappas. I do think some of it is the river's is higher than it used to be. I think we have a little bit of everything going on in Riverside. And I do think it has to do with not cleaning out the creek beds. And We're starting to do that in Fishward Creek. That's being done right now through the Corps. But I'd like to see more of that. And actually, we found out that FEMA gives a grant for that. So I'm all for it.
Okay. Yeah, and I know those tide flex or those tide check valves you referenced. Now they're putting in a lot of those in St. Augustine to a lot of effect. I know they're very happy with the results they're seeing down there. So that kind of leads me to the next question, which is from Leslie Keys, who is at Flagler College down there in St. Augustine. So this is for you, Mr. Suma, I believe. She's asking if your consideration of regional efforts expand beyond Duval County. She points to the work that's being done there in St. Augustine that they're doing as just kind of a city on their own working on these resiliency issues. And she also encourages people to pay attention to keeping history above water in Charleston next year. I went to the one they hosted down in St. Augustine last year, and that was great. So Mr. Suma?
Yes, I agree. That was a fantastic event. We participated in that as well. It was really well done. But yes, regionally speaking, we have projects that are actually ongoing in many parts of the region. Councilmember DeFore mentioned the local one here, Fishware Creek, that's ongoing. We've got a flood study going on in Nassau County in a place called Thomas Creek in Nassau County. St. Augustine actually wrote us a letter and asked to be part of a back-based study. So as we mentioned, it's part of their resiliency efforts. What we've been finding is we've been working on the coast for years. We've been placing sand on beaches for years as a resiliency management measure for coastal communities. But lately, what we've been finding is partly due to increased sea level rise, we've been finding back bay flooding becoming more and more a significant factor for communities. St. Augustine experienced a lot of flooding in Irma and Matthew, and they asked us to initiate a study for them to look at that. And so we've put that request up to headquarters, and this is just another kind of informational bit. We have to compete for study funds against the entire nation. So, St. Augustine, it's a national historic treasure, right? And so we hope that competes well. But if Jacksonville decides to go the study route, it's going to have to compete for funding as well. But yeah, we're looking regionally all the time. We're actually trying to help Flagler County currently on their coast. We're trying to give them some help on their beaches as well. So a lot happening regionally in Florida.
Okay, great. Thank you. So this is, I guess, a question for both of you. So David Bruderly points out that the sea level rise and more intense flooding are really symptoms of climate change, which is being driven by man-made fossil fuel emissions. Addressing those emissions, is that something that local and regional entities or governments should be addressing? And are you two committed to trying to address that?
I guess I'll start.
Okay.
It's kind of to me. Well, first of all, I would say that emissions are not part of the Corps' mission area. We are a water-based infrastructure unit. So, but I would say that it's kind of the situation where pay now or pay later. We know that climate change is related to the rising sea levels that we're finding, and so and it's just getting more and more expensive, as I alluded to. So my recommendation would be that yes, whatever can be done at the local, state, and national levels to curb emissions would only decrease the cost of the management measures that are going to be necessary down the road.
Well, I would just add that, we're looking at all, everything we can in terms of what the causes are and how we can address those causes.
Okay, and Councilwoman DeFore, sorry. So I know a thing that's on a lot of people's minds here in Jacksonville right now is the recent announcement about Lot J, and the city is contributing a lot of money to that project. So Bud Para is wondering, do you think we should be spending a similar amount of money on flood prevention projects?
Yes,
Okay.
I do.
Okay, great. Thank you. Mr. Suma, this is from George. How will the dredging of the St. Johns River affect resiliency in Jacksonville?
Okay, thank you for that. So yeah, we have taken a look at that, especially post Hurricane Matthew. We look specifically at the effects of the port enhancement efforts on resiliency in the area. We developed an environmental assessment for that, and we posted it. It's publicly available. My thoughts on that are that the information in that document probably could have been communicated a little bit better, because when I hear people talk about the effects of the deepening on resiliency in the city, I hear either a misunderstanding or maybe it's miscommunication on our part. But so the bottom line is that whenever you do any deepening, you are basically increasing the efficiency of a particular channel. The deepening does increase the efficiency of the channel in the lower part of the river. As soon as you go up in depth from what's currently being dredged down to 47 feet, you go up in depth to 40 feet. That is where the largest effect is seen. So you're talking about at the lower river near the port. In terms of effects down here in downtown and further, the effects were extremely small. And so if we didn't communicate that well enough initially, we need to do a better job communicating it.
Okay, thank you. I think
just because of time constraints, we're going to get moving forward to get around to your panel discussion. So before we move forward, I have two final comments. One relates to sharing the poll results, and then other is an announcement of the Northeast Florida Regional Council. So I'm sharing the results of the poll on the screen. We will try to share this afterwards. And so for question number one, have you ever been personally affected by flooding? There's a 50-50 response rate, which is interesting. Not everyone lives in a flood-prone area. Then when we look at question number two, we're familiar with the South Atlantic Coastal Study before this discussion. There was a good amount of yes, but the majority was no. So that's kind of a call to action on different angles to promote better community outreach, and the Regional Council is always interested in supporting those activities. Number three, were you familiar with the Jacksonville Special Committee on Resiliency before this discussion? The majority said yes, 51 responses. So that's a good thing. It means that the city is gaining traction with community engagement. And this is a valuable question for the city of Jacksonville. Do you believe that a chief resilience officer will better assist the city in navigating issues related to resilience? Overwhelming, I mean, the entire response was yes. 0% said no, 6 people said not sure, and that might just be because of a lack of familiarity with the appointment or position. So we will share these poll results later with audience members. And the final comment that I'd like to make before moving forward into the next panel discussion, there was a question posed by Mary Tapuni asking about broadening the scope. We're dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic right now and other related uncertainty moving into the future. And so I just wanted to make a plug and announce that the Northeast Florida Regional Council recently received federal funding from the U.S. Economic Development Administration. And so tomorrow we will officially be convening the Northeast Florida Economic Resilience Task Force, which will be comprised of expert representation from every county in the region. And so in the first year of this task force, our main objective will be to tackle issues related to economic injury incurred because of the coronavirus pandemic. But moving into year 2, we're going to broaden the scope of that task force to address hurricanes, sea level rise, economic disruptions, pandemics, and the full gambit of what we can face moving into the future. So a public notice is available on NEFRC.org right at the top of our homepage. So without moving forward, I'd like to extend a very sincere appreciation to our invited panelists, Councilwoman Randy DeFore and Mr. Eric Suma. We were very grateful to hear from both of your perspectives this evening. I personally found it very insightful, and I know that our audience members did as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to WJCT, the council, and to the Jacksonville Environmental Protection Board for hosting. Thank you very much.
All right, and so without further ado, we're going to bring on Brennan Rivers and our next panelist for a discussion on community engagement. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Sean. If members of this panel could go ahead and unmute themselves and turn the webcams on, we'll go ahead and get started. So for the second panel discussion, we're going to be discussing environmental justice and community engagement. I'm joined by District 1 City Councilwoman Joyce Morgan. She's playing a key role on the City Special Committee on Resiliency. Thank you for joining us, Councilwoman.
Thank you for having me.
Glad to have you here. We also welcome Ashante Green, a Jacksonville native who grew up on the East Side. She is an entrepreneur, a green business owner, an advocate for environmental justice, and she's a subject matter expert for the Special Committee on Resiliency. It's great to have you with us tonight, Ms. Green.
Thank you very much.
And our final panelist is Dr. Todd Sack, who is also a subject matter expert for the Resiliency Committee. Dr. Sack is a GI doctor here in Jacksonville, and he speaks internationally on climate change, energy policy, and health. Thank you for being with us tonight, Dr. Sack.
I'm delighted to be with you. Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Green, I would like to start with you. What does the term environmental justice mean to you, and what does it look like here in Jacksonville?
Oh, yeah, definitely. So to me, environmental justice, it means the fair treatment and ensuring that everyone has equitable access to protection of health, environmental health problems, access to fresh food, safe housing, and as well as resources, regardless of your race, your color, your national orientation, or your income, and also to be invited and involved in the decision-making for environmental laws as well as policies that affect the community. When we're looking at Jacksonville, what it looks like is the fact that we face many issues regarding the environment everywhere, but we actually have some of the highest rates of food insecurity, energy burden, and Superfund sites in some of the minority and lower income communities. And especially given the fact that Jacksonville has actually been identified as 1 in 10 EPA environmental justice showcase communities. So it means that on a national level, the environmental justice issues in Jacksonville has been acknowledged, and there is work being done to address it.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Councilwoman Morgan, you're a member of the city's Special Committee on Resiliency, where you serve as chair of the Subcommittee on Education, Protection of Local Neighborhoods, and Community Outreach. As the chair of that subcommittee, what are your priorities?
Well, thank you so much. First to WJCT and to you, Brendan, for putting on this community outreach effort. I will tell you that I have a group of subject matter experts that will just blow your mind with what they know and how they communicate. And that's what we're here to do. We're to communicate. We have 3 subcommittees that are working in tandem. We have a committee on, of course, education, protection of local neighborhoods and community outreach, but a subcommittee on infrastructure and a subcommittee on environmental planning. Well, the thing about it is that we have these committees going, but who knows about it? And how do we get that information out to the community in a way that is succinct and one that they can understand very easily without, going to the dictionary, for instance. The sheer definition of resiliency, that's another thing we're working on. Community assets, identifying those community assets, looking for how we go about community engagement. And that's one of the things that Ashante Green is really working hard on. And then, of course, our newsletter. And of course, I'll talk more about that because Sean Lahab has done an amazing job with that. And the newsletter is out. And we will be discussing it at our next meeting on Thursday.
Okay, and Dr. Sack, as I mentioned, you're a subject matter expert for this Resiliency Committee, and throughout your career, you've served on various boards and committees focused on climate change and the environment. What have you learned during your time working on this issue that could help Jacksonville as it starts trying to address environmental injustices?
Thank you, Brendan. What I've learned is that most of Jacksonville leaders have acknowledged that we have decades of catching up to do to repair the damages of environmental injustice. So how do we move forward? This can only be done successfully if we involve the community in the decisions that affect them. To correct environmental injustice, we must make sure that there are 3 essential ingredients in any decision of planning or development for a community. First, are community members informed well in advance of discussions or plans for their community? Are community members part of the discussions, including early in the planning and with the wishes of the community assured? And finally, are community members fully represented adequately on the committees and boards that make the decisions affecting these communities? Involvement is key if we're going to make progress.
Okay, great, thank you. Ms. Green, the Tampa Bay Times reported shortly after Hurricane Irma did a lot of damage here that Jacksonville's leaders have left plans to fix flooding issues unfunded for decades. Those issues, as you noted earlier, are most severe in some of Jacksonville's poorest and mostly Black neighborhoods near the polluted waterways tied to the St. Johns River. Should people in these communities push their local governments to fix these issues? And if not, who should they be looking to for help?
Yeah, very good question. I think the point of us even being here is a testament of the work that city is doing and the attention that's being faced on resiliency and flooding. When it comes to citizens and communities, I think the question kind of assumes that citizens don't push towards local government to fix issues. I think the better or bigger question is to make sure that citizens are being heard and included. And I think being someone that came from a community that is a environmental justice area and now being an advocate and deciding to run for soil and water to make sure we have equitable access to education, I think we have to identify that the responsibility of the health of the environment does not rest solely on the shoulders of residents, but also just making sure that we have everyone at the table, including those local officials like what we're doing now, the subject matter experts, and making sure that we are having proactive conversations and that we are leading in facts, data, and we are pushing towards solutions, because I feel that oftentimes it's easy to look at the negative impacts. But if we can look at some other communities all around the nation that is leading the charge in environmental justice, we can definitely move towards that as well. So I definitely feel that citizens should push to local government, but also rely on the great resources we have with subject matter experts and the other multitude of organizations that is doing the work to educate on the topics at hand.
I'm definitely sensing a common theme here with your answers. Maybe to follow up, Ms. Green, are there some organizations or ways that you can think of where people can get involved in this process, since you say this is such an important part?
Yeah, for sure. So like I said, being an EPA target community, the EPA has identified multiple tools to engage citizens on the work that is being done. Being that we have a lot of soil contamination, the city actually gets money and is addressing specific soil contaminated sites and Superfund sites, and they always publish community meetings. There was actually one today on the Kier McGee site. So I would say get plugged in with the work that the EPA and the Jacksonville Environmental Protection Board is doing, and plug into the organizations that are keepers of the environment, like the Sierra Club, as well as the St. Johns River Keeper, because I think education and awareness and advocacy is where we start in having those conversations.
All right, great, thank you. So Dr. Sack, we've seen in Jacksonville that climate change frequently gets framed primarily as a flooding and an infrastructure problem. Are there some other areas of concern you think our region should be focusing on when we're talking about these issues?
Absolutely. Resiliency is far more than just building more bulkheads. We have to keep in mind this extreme health effects of climate change that will affect us all, but particularly people in disadvantaged communities. People will be dying from extreme heat days and from flooding and from extreme storms. Air pollution has far more serious effects on those hot days, causing asthma and heart attacks and deaths. People living in poverty, as I said, are more seriously affected by all of these health effects of climate change. But we're really not informing people or informing our health professionals or planning for these health threats from climate change. We need to keep that always in our planning process.
Okay, and that leads perfectly into my next question, which is for you, Councilwoman Morgan. A recent study shows that Jacksonville neighborhoods that were redlined, that's the discriminatory practice of denying services to residents in certain areas, and it was banned about 50 years ago. So these redlined areas, they get nearly 10 degrees hotter in the summer than areas that were ranked as the city's most desirable neighborhoods, partly because these redlined areas, they have fewer trees and they have more impervious surfaces. So that's like sidewalks and concrete and stuff like that. So these low income, often mostly Black neighborhoods can also experience severe flooding like we saw in the Ken Knight Drive area during Hurricane Irma. So there's lots of discrepancies here. What is the city doing and what can it do to help these residents and to get them involved in the process?
Thank you for that question. And I think Ms. Green started talking about that, but quite frankly, I tell you that the city of Jacksonville is starting to really move in the direction that we need to move in. When I was a new council member back in 2015, we came in and had 2 hurricanes back to back. I think it was Irma in 17 and then Michael in 18. And I just think that those 2 events that didn't even hit us, we didn't get a direct hit, we were just skirted, caused so much damage. And I think we learned a valuable lesson as a city. And I think we really started moving in a direction that we knew we had to do something. And I think your other panelists had talked about the fact that the AAA, the Adaptation Action Area Work Group, was started in 2019. The Ken Knight Drive, the buyout program, council just approved $5 million for that. So we have things going on, but it is a process. And that's why this special committee on resiliency for the city council is so important. And what we are doing on my subcommittee is especially important because we have to reach the community and we have to reach them where they are, not at a level of that's so high that they really can't fathom what we're talking about and what we need them to do. We've got to come on their terms. City Council just passed another bill that allocates $60,000 to community workshops that will be beginning in January. So another opportunity to go directly to our citizens. That's what we have to do. That's where we have to communicate this. That's where we have to make a difference right at their level, right to them, Brenda.
Okay, thank you, Councilwoman. Ms. Green, you told me you grew up on the east side in one of Jacksonville's red line neighborhoods, and so you said you saw firsthand how climate impacts were affecting people in the community. Can you describe what that was like to us and tell us what you think and what people in these communities think the city should be doing to help? Did we lose you, Ms. Green? You still there? All right, I'll move on to a question for Dr. Stack. Hopefully we can get Ms. Green back on in a second. Dr. Stack, you've been in Jacksonville working in the climate sphere for a long time. How has the public dialogue around climate change shifted in our area over the years, and how does it compare to other major cities?
Well, thank you. Actually, there have been a lot of changes in the last couple of years. The big change is really that now people in Jacksonville have very much the same views as Americans in general. I'd like to share with you some data from a Yale and George Mason University study that came out, a survey of Americans completed in April 2020 on the climate change issue. And they found that 72% of Americans and 72% of Duval County adults believe that climate change is occurring. Likewise, 64% of Americans and 64% of Jacksonville folks are worried about climate change. And the same number say that climate change is caused by man and not by natural events. And if you ask people whether they want their governor or the president to do more about climate change, 60% of Americans and 60% of Duval County adults say yes. So what's the big changes over the past 10 years, people in Jacksonville have come to understand this problem and they want something done about it. And I think that's a big reason why city government is now moving.
Okay, Ms. Green, do we have you back?
Yeah,
Here she is.
how are y'all doing?
All right, good to have you back. All right, so I'll just quickly repeat my question for you in case you missed it. So you told me you grew up on the east side in one of Jacksonville's red line neighborhoods, and you saw firsthand how climate change was impacting people. Can you just kind of describe what that was like, seeing that and growing up with that, and what you and other people in these communities think the city should be doing?
Yeah, very, very good question. So growing up on the east side, just to give you a little bit of topography, I grew up on the east side, literally blocks away from the Jaguar Stadium, and could watch the game from the street. But ultimately growing up in the vibrance of the community, in a community that was so close-knit and full of culture, everyone pretty much worked together to try to overcome as much adversity as possible. Being completely honest, being someone that really cares about people and planet, growing up, I really did not know that some of the issues we faced when it came to the higher asthma rates, or some of the disparities, or the fact that we didn't have access to fresh food was due to environmental issues and the status of the soil, water, and air. So like I said before, due to the east side being roped in by highways, everybody had asthma. I had asthma growing up. We all went to the same asthma doctor. You know what I mean? And ultimately, later finding out that heat is hotter in that community. Growing up, there were people that had issues with heat stroke and kidney issues as well. So that's ultimately what it looked like. And just to say what it looks like right now, back to the EPA, they have a lot of great tools. They have an EJ screening tool that you can literally plug in any address to see what the environmental justice stressors and indicators are based on the community and the demographics. So I went to R.L. Brown on the east side. I plugged in that address and saw that it has some very severe issues when it comes to air toxicity and the likelihood of getting a cancer is at about 80%. And then I plugged in the school that my son currently goes to, Ortega. They're at maybe I think it was a 19%. So there are severe disparities in communities that need more attention on environmental justice. And I feel that having these conversations and doing the work that's currently being done is helping to address some of those disparities that we have.
Okay, great. Thank you. Councilwoman Morgan, you've been a member, so this is kind of getting back to what I was asking Dr. Stack earlier. You've been a member of the City Council as the dialogue around climate change has really shifted locally. What do you think has caused that in City Hall? And you kind of mentioned this these workshops that you're planning. Is that, or do you have any other plans to kind of capitalize on this momentum?
Oh, absolutely. And the $60,000 is actually a grant that the city has received. So they have to put an RFP out on the street. It should be coming out very quickly, because this RFP is going to be set up where there are going to be community outreach sessions in the 6 planning districts of Jacksonville. And whoever is the person who answers the RFP and gets RFP, they have to start these in January. So this is very timely. It comes at a time when, like I said, our newsletter, not our newsletter, but the Northeast Regional Council has put out a newsletter, and Sean LaHave did that. It is excellent. And I do want everyone to get that link, read what it's talking about. It's talking about all of the things that we're doing. It's talking about all of the things that the city has been doing since around 2019. And it just kind of lays out the fact that we're looking at everything. We're looking at zoning. We're looking at local hazard mitigation. We're looking at building codes. We're looking at all of those things that are ever important to making this city better. And just like I said, even with the voluntary buyout program that's going on at Knight Drive, that can make a huge difference for the people at Knight that are impacted, just like Shante Green was talking about with the environmental justice. This is all wrapped around what we're talking about. And that's why we have to continue to work so hard, especially in our committee, to make sure that we are getting that word out and we are getting to the people and making sure that everybody understands it. Because I think that with all of the subject matter experts that we have on my subcommittee alone, we might be talking in a different tone and a different level to the people that we really need to be reaching and impacting their lives. I think it's one thing if you know all of this, but as Ms. Green said, when she grew up, they didn't necessarily know all of this. They knew something was wrong, but could they identify exactly what those things were and what was causing it? No, most times we can't, but we know something is wrong. And so the city is on a roll. When we get that chief resiliency officer in, Brendan, and I'll stop at this. One of the things that I believe that these three subcommittees are doing is we are basically setting up the job for our new resiliency officer. When that officer comes in, we have done so much groundwork. We've done the base. That work won't have to be done again. This person will come in and be able to hit the ground rolling and rolling fast. And that's exactly what the city of Jacksonville needs. We need somebody who can come in and get the work done and get it done quickly. We don't, I don't think we have time for a very long learning curve. Thank you, Brenda.
Okay, yeah, I just want to follow up real quickly on that. So, I mean, you're kind of talking about this energy and momentum that we're seeing in City Hall now. So I'm just curious if you have any idea what has caused that. Is it sort of following on what Dr. Sack was discussing earlier, just sort of this general shift in opinion, or do you think there was something that happened that kind of sparked this energy within City Hall?
I don't know if it was something that exactly happened, but for me, I can tell you it was the two storms back to back and just the sheer impact. And remember, when those storms hit us, we had so much debris that we were having to do transfers, picking it up in different neighborhoods and then taking it out and then coming back and picking up some more. Right here in District 1, it was a mess. We had so many trees down. It was, and again, we weren't even hit by the storm. We were not even hit by the storm, but we were gravely impacted by what happened with those two storms. So for me, it was certainly that. Now remember, I come from a media background, so I've covered these storms. It was so different. It was really, really different. I live near the water, and I was going across the street to my neighbor's house and saying, hey, the water is kind of high back there. I just want you guys to be aware that we have shelters in place if you need to leave. And I'm your council member, and I'm not going to sit here across the street from you and watch this water rise like this and you guys not do anything. So it was a reckoning for me.
Yeah, I think it was for a lot of people. So Ms. Green, the protests against police violence since the death of George Floyd have reignited discussions about environmental justice across the country. But you've told me that within the local racial justice movement, climate and the environment aren't really part of the conversation at this point. Why do you think that is? And is anyone working to change that? Ms. Green, do we have you still?
I'm sorry, I was muted.
No, that's okay.
Yeah, no problem. You guys missed some good stuff, but it's okay. No, so the things that happened and that really reactivated and sparked some of the protests and things that had taken place in Jacksonville, climate justice and that conversation is not at the forefront right now, but it doesn't mean that it's not in, there isn't work being done. I feel that just literally the fact that we are having this conversation, it's literally the conversations that spark the action. So I think right now it is literally a lot of things that are impeding. When we're talking about sea level rise and some of the resiliency things that we're talking about, some of the racial justice and the police brutality things that are being addressed in the protests are urgent. They feel very urgent. And I think that's definitely why those are at the forefront. But there's work being done, and I am happy to be a part of the conversation to make sure that citizens know about the environmental justice issues and solutions that are being brought forward. There's also an organization here called the New Florida Majority that just hired a climate justice organizer in the city. So I'm working with them to make sure that they have educational resources and can definitely advocate and advise local officials on what needs to happen. They just actually had a climate justice webinar maybe about 3 days ago. So the work is being done, but I think just as we're talking about resiliency more and more, we'll definitely talk about environmental justice more as well.
Okay, thank you very much. We got another minute or two here. Dr. Sack, did you want to follow up on the point that Ms. Green was making about these the movement that we've been seeing recently?
Well, I had 2 points I wanted to make. Thank you. First was that because some of the justice leaders are involved in other aspects of justice, it makes it even more important that those of us working on climate change, on resiliency, be sure we bring to the table the voices from disadvantaged communities. But I didn't want us to end on such a doom and gloom note. We have 20 years to transform our economy from fossil fuel based to renewable energy and efficiency based. And that transformation offers great opportunity for new businesses, new jobs, and better health with it. And I think part of the leadership that we need in our community is to encourage those new industries to develop, let the jobs occur in Jacksonville, and really let us prosper with the new economy that's going to occur.
Okay, great. And Councilwoman Morgan, anything you want to add before we move on to questions from the audience?
No, I just want to echo what Dr. Sack just said. And when you look around, we don't want to be left behind. I mean, quite frankly, don't want to be left behind. Want to make sure that we're moving in the direction that's going to keep our citizens healthier and preserve our environment for the future. We want our children to be able to enjoy trees. And by the way, if you don't know it, and I think probably most of the people on this call already know that, you can call 630 City and ask for trees, especially if you have the right of way, city right of way. You can ask for trees to be planted there. So we have a lot of opportunities. We have a tree mitigation fund that has a lot of money in it. So just look for ways. And I think when we're curious, that's when we do our best work. Thank you, Brendan.
All right, thank you very much. Sean, I think Sean has been monitoring for questions from the audience. Sean, do we have anything?
Thank you. And before we get to questions, I will be launching the poll. That will be available for 5 minutes, and then we will review the poll results around 8:25. All right. So we got a few questions here, and we're going to start off with Councilwoman Morgan, who was asked a specific question. And so from a historical angle, this is a very interesting question. So Bruce Foraker asks, Councilwoman Morgan, when consolidation passed, a promise was made that the city would provide water and sewer to undeserved neighborhoods. Can we find the funds to start the process of getting these areas off of septic tanks, either through bonding or on a pay-as-you-go basis?
Sure, thank you, Sean. First of all, when we came into office in 2015, there was already an effort to start some kind of septic tank phase out. But as you know, the septic tank phase out cost an enormous amount of money. And I think we had put in $15 million, JEA put in another $15 million, and we started. However, I think there are only 2 communities that so far since that started have been able to get this going. So now we're even looking at, yes, we do need septic tank phase out, but is the cost commensurate with what we're actually going to get from doing that? And is there another way to do it? Those are the things that JEA is right now looking at. So I think we're going to do it. It's just like anything else, is how do you do it? Just in my district alone, we have so many septic tanks that it would cost, I think, $200 and some odd million just to do my little area. We have 14 districts. We have a lot of septic tanks that need to be addressed, and it is going to be a monumental job. It's not for the faint of heart. I would say that, Sean.
Thank you. And so leading into the next, this is not a question, this was more of a comment, but I do believe that this would tie into Dr. Sack's interest, especially related to climate mitigation on the topic of JEA. So David writes, it is not widely recognized that the JEA management team has been taking actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions for many years. This has been done by shifting to natural gas and utility scale solar electricity. The next step is to expand efficiency and emission reductions to smaller scale consumer-driven efforts. To maximize use of public monies and return on investment, JEA is ideally positioned to integrate greenhouse gas reductions into resiliency and environmental justice policies and programs. So obviously that was not a question, it was more of a observation, but I do believe that Dr. Sack might have some insight to add to that point.
Well, there are two great opportunities the city has and where leadership can make a big difference. The first is the electric car. In 2024, the electric car will be cheaper to build than the gas car. So why doesn't the city put in more charging stations and have people feel comfortable with an electric car? Each electric car owner saves $1,500 a year over the person who had a gas car. Gosh, if I was a politician, I could put $1,500 in everyone's pocket. That's the solution. It also helps JEA to use their excess capacity of electricity. So electric cars are a great place for leadership in our city. The second is solar panels on the home. If you have the right roof, solar panels are a great deal. There's a 26% federal tax credit that actually diminishes in 2021 and then goes away for homeowners, though it will remain a great deal for businesses. Gosh, if you have a roof put on electricity generating solar panels this year before December 31st, you're going to make a lot of money. So these are 2 areas where citizens can move forward and really make a difference.
And thank you. And do any of our other panelists have anything to add to that specific comment?
I'm looking at an electric car.
Good for you.
Thank you.
I think to add on to that, being that energy burden is one of the highest here in the state, I think some initiatives for solar in some of those most vulnerable communities and to tap into those solar co-ops and to support them would be a great thing. as well as the fact that there are heat disparities that are higher in certain communities. So just being very intentional and mindful of definitely maybe reevaluating how we use some of those tree mitigation funds to make sure that we are just planting them where they need to be planted in communities, maybe without the request, but to also go in to educate the community on why we need the trees. So that's my point.
Thank you. And so before getting to our final questions, there was one sort of technical question asked, which I have insight on and we can complement it. Would resiliency be enhanced by placing electric power lines and cable TV lines underground? And so if any of you have insight, that'd be appreciated. All I will say is that Beaches Electric out in Jacks Beach, the utility, they recently got involved with an initiative to bury power lines around the Palm Valley, Ponte Vedra area. So that's a local initiative that I'm familiar with, but I'm not really sure about Duval County. So I'm interested to hear your perspectives.
Well, in Duval County, I can tell you that even in District 1, we're looking at the possibilities of doing that. I think every time people talk about burying lines that are already overhead, the sheer cost of it is always the factor that comes up and makes everybody go, oh, we can't do this, we can't do this. But at one of the roundabouts that we have at Rojero and Arlington Road, even though we initially did not have the money to underground it, Public Works did find the money to put the conduit underground, so that now we are about to get the money to actually do some undergrounding. We know it's very expensive, and I've heard the debate on both sides on it being good and then the other side saying it not being good, but I would love to see it. I think it would just make a dramatic improvement in our neighborhoods.
Thank you. And so this leads to the final question that we will present tonight. And I think this is a good question from one of our audience members, Jennifer. To all, what is the key message about resiliency that a citizen or resident in Jacksonville should hear and share with their friends and neighbors?
Okay, who do you want to start? I guess I'll go first, Sean. Okay, so we're dealing with that definition right now about resiliency, what we want people to understand about resiliency. And we've used the terms that resiliency is the ability of a community to bounce back after a catastrophic event, and whether that's flooding, whether that's hurricane, or what happens in a community. So I think our definition, we are going to be looking at it again on Thursday, but to me, I just want them to understand that we are resilient and able to bounce back and make a comeback and put things together and hopefully put them together better.
Thank you.
I'll go second. You know, the current Resiliency Committee in Jacksonville is the 5th committee we've had in 4 years. I think this one's finally getting it right, thanks to the leadership of Councilwoman DeFore and Morgan and many, many others. But I think we as citizens need to hold our leaders' hands to the fire and insist that they implement the recommendations of this current Resiliency Committee, but go beyond that to work towards a long-term climate change mitigation strategy for our city. We're probably going to need not just a resiliency officer, but a resiliency and energy commission that will bring in broad input from all of our communities. This is an environmental justice answer as well. And a commission that will come up with a long-term plan for converting from fossil fuels to renewable energy efficiency and build jobs and prepare us for the next 100 years. So that's the long-term challenge to our leaders. Create a long-term process, have a real plan for our citizens.
Yeah, and I'll bring us home. I will bring us home. I tell you. So I think, like, when I tell anyone in regards to the environment, The environment is the one thing that affects and touches us all. And the same with the concept of resiliency in our vulnerableness to flooding and sea level rise, especially being in Florida. And you never know when a hurricane is going to come, to add the issues of flooding on rainy days. So I would say be engaged citizens and tap into all of the resources and the great work that is being done now. All of the resiliency subcommittees is open to the public, and we definitely encourage you to tap in, to submit your public comments. And then Resiliency Jax is a great organization that is off the ground now, that pulls in more of those great organizations I was talking about. So I would say definitely get engaged, get educated, and share.
Thank you. And I'm going to invite Brendan back to the conversation. I'm going to share the poll results, which he can read off. Let me know if you can see them, Brendan. And then we will carry it off with an outro and goodbye.
I am not seeing them.
Okay. So
you can go ahead and share them.
Yeah, so I can share them. So on question number 1, is environmental or climate justice something you have heard about from local groups or local news? And the overwhelming answer is yes, 79% of respondents. So that is a good sign based on those who are in the audience, but obviously there's a bigger picture with how many people live in Duval County. Question number 2. Research shows that minority communities are disproportionately affected by pollution and the impacts of climate change. Do you think Jacksonville is doing enough to address these disparities? And 0% of respondents said yes. So 86% said no, and 14% said not sure. Obviously, this is a call to action based on the respondents here. There's a pretty clear answer of how people felt about this question. And then finally, question number 3. Do you feel like your own neighborhood is safe from flooding? And this was a mixed bag, about 50-50 or 41-45. So 41% of respondents said yes, 45% said no, and 14% said not sure. So again, similar to my panel discussion, there's a lot of different geographies in Duval County, and everyone has their own problems, but it is an interesting question to ask. So before I hand it back off to Brendan, I would just like to extend a very special thank you to everyone who participated in this event tonight. I'm very grateful to know each of you, and the work that's being done at the local level is tremendously inspiring. And on a personal note, I'd also like to thank my colleagues at WJCT, especially Brendan Rivers. And I'd like to extend a very special thank you to Mr. James Richardson, the program administrator for the Jacksonville Environmental Protection Board. He is a great colleague to work with, and we were very grateful to have him on board with this. So without further ado, I'm going to give it back to Brendan to close off this discussion.
All right, thank you, Sean, and panelists. Thank you all so much for being here with us tonight. A big thank you to our audience as well. If you would all keep an eye out for a follow-up email with a post-event survey that should be hitting your inbox shortly. And if you want to know about future events like this, or if you want to read my latest stories about Northeast Florida, you can subscribe to the ADAPT newsletter at adaptflorida.org. And just a quick reminder, we do have another event coming up on the 22nd of October, where we'll be releasing this year's State of the St. Johns River report and hosting another panel discussion with local elected officials, scientists, and subject matter experts to talk about what's in that report. So details on that event can also be found at adaptflorida.org. Financial support for ADAPT comes from WJCT readers and listeners, with additional support from the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations and the 2040 Foundation. And tonight would not have been possible without the help of James Richardson and the Jacksonville Environmental Protection Board, as well as Sean LaHave and everyone at the Northeast Florida Regional Council. So again, thank you to everyone involved. Audience, thank you so much for joining us and for all the great questions. Stay safe. Have a good night.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Brendan.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night.